Marcus Thompson adjusted his tie for the third time as he walked into the hotel bar. The aviation conference had ended an hour ago, and he was ready to unwind with a drink and maybe impress some people with his stories. At 35, Marcus worked as a commercial airline pilot for a major carrier, but tonight he felt like being someone more exciting. The bar was dimly lit with warm amber lighting, filled with conference attendees still wearing their name badges. Marcus chose a seat at the polished wooden bar and ordered a whiskey neat. He loved these industry events because they gave him a chance to network and, if he was being honest, show off a little. A woman in a crisp navy blazer sat 2 stools down from him, quietly sipping what looked like a gin and tonic. She had short auburn hair and an air of quiet confidence that immediately caught Marcus's attention. Her name badge was turned backward so he couldn't see her name or company. Marcus struck up a conversation with the bartender, making sure his voice carried just enough for others nearby to hear. "You know, flying commercial is fine and all, but it's nothing like the rush of military aviation," he said, swirling his whiskey. "Back in my day, I flew some serious missions. Nothing beats the adrenaline of combat flying." The woman glanced over briefly, then returned to her drink without comment. Marcus took this as encouragement to continue. "I was stationed overseas for 3 years," Marcus went on, embellishing the truth. In reality, he had been in the Air Force for 4 years but had never seen combat. He had flown transport planes, moving supplies and personnel around domestic bases. But tonight, surrounded by civilian aviation professionals, he felt safe expanding his story. "Some of those missions were classified, if you know what I mean." The bartender nodded politely while cleaning glasses. A small group of people nearby had started listening, which gave Marcus the confidence to continue. "Fighter jets are incredible machines," Marcus said, his voice growing more animated. "The F-16 Fighting Falcon was my bird of choice. They call it the Viper in combat circles. Once you've felt that kind of power, everything else feels slow." The woman's head turned slightly, and Marcus caught what might have been the hint of a smile. Encouraged, he pressed on. "The training alone was intense, learning to handle G-forces, aerial combat maneuvers, targeting systems. Most people can't handle it, but I took to it naturally." Marcus paused to take a sip of his whiskey, enjoying the attention he was getting from the small audience that had gathered. "Tell us about a specific mission," someone called out from the group. Marcus's pulse quickened slightly, but he had watched enough military documentaries and movies to piece together something convincing. "Well, I can't go into too much detail, you understand. But there was this one time over enemy territory. We were providing air support for ground troops who had gotten pinned down." He painted a picture of swooping down through enemy fire, making split-second decisions and successfully completing the mission despite overwhelming odds. The story grew more dramatic with each sentence, and Marcus found himself getting caught up in his own narrative. "The worst part was when we took some hits," Marcus continued. "Engine trouble, damaged wing. Had to limp back to base on half power. But that's what separates the real pilots from the weekend flyers. When everything goes wrong, training kicks in." The woman at the bar had turned her stool slightly to face him now, listening intently. Marcus felt a surge of confidence. She was attractive and clearly interested in his stories. "How many combat missions did you fly?" she asked quietly. "Lost count after the first year," Marcus replied without missing a beat. "Some were routine reconnaissance, others were full combat engagements." "You learned to take it one mission at a time?" The woman nodded slowly, her green eyes studying his face. "That must have been difficult, transitioning back to civilian aviation after all that excitement." "It was," Marcus agreed, warming to the sympathy in her voice. "Commercial flying feels like driving a bus compared to combat aviation. But someone has to do the regular work, right? Can't all be heroes." The group around them had grown larger, and Marcus was enjoying being the center of attention. He ordered another round of drinks and continued sharing what he claimed were war stories, each one more elaborate than the last. "The thing about combat flying," Marcus said, gesturing with his glass, "is that it changes you. You see things, do things that most people can't imagine. The brotherhood among combat pilots is something special. We look out for each other because we know what it's like to have someone's life in your hands." The woman listened to every word, occasionally asking thoughtful questions that only seemed to encourage Marcus to elaborate further. He talked about the weight of responsibility, the split-second decisions, and the unbreakable bonds formed in combat. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "Every day," Marcus replied, and for a moment he almost believed his own story. But you reach a point where you want to come home, start a family, live a normal life. The war follows you, though. Some nights I still wake up thinking I'm in the cockpit. The woman's expression was unreadable, but she seemed genuinely engaged. Marcus felt like he was making a real connection, not just telling stories for entertainment. As the evening wore on and the crowd began to thin out, Marcus found himself talking more and more to just the woman. She had a way of asking questions that made him want to share more, to paint himself as even more heroic and experienced than he had originally planned. "What's your name?" Marcus finally asked, realizing they had been talking for over an hour. "Sarah," she replied simply. "And yours?" "Marcus Thompson. Pleased to meet you, Sarah." He raised his glass in a small toast. "Here's to interesting conversations with beautiful women." Sarah smiled and clinked her glass against his. "Here's to interesting stories," she said. And something in her tone made Marcus wonder if there was more meaning behind her words than he understood. Marcus felt confident as the evening progressed. Sarah seemed genuinely interested in his stories, and he found himself elaborating even more on his supposed combat experience. The bar had grown quieter, with only a few conference attendees remaining. "You know what the hardest part about combat flying really is?" Marcus said, leaning closer to Sarah. "It's not the enemy fire or the technical challenges. It's making life or death decisions in seconds. When you're providing close air support for troops on the ground, their lives depend on your accuracy." Sarah nodded thoughtfully, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. "That kind of responsibility must be overwhelming." It was, Marcus agreed, getting more comfortable with his fabricated persona. "I remember this one mission, where we had to take out an enemy position that was dangerously close to friendly forces. The margin for error was maybe 50 meters. One wrong move and you're hitting your own people." He painted a vivid picture of flying through heavy anti-aircraft fire, making precise bombing runs while enemy fighters pursued him. The story grew more detailed as he spoke, drawing on every military movie and documentary he had ever watched. "How did you handle the stress?" Sarah asked, her green eyes focused intently on his face. Marcus was pleased by her continued interest. "Training and instinct," he said. "Plus you learn to compartmentalize. In the moment, you're just focused on the mission. The emotional weight hits you later, usually back at base." "What kind of aircraft did you say you flew again?" Sarah asked casually. "F-16 Fighting Falcon," Marcus replied immediately. "The Viper, as we called it in the squadron. Incredible machine. Single-engine, multi-role fighter. Could do air-to-air combat or ground attack missions with equal effectiveness." Sarah leaned forward slightly. "Tell me about the Viper's capabilities. What made it special for your missions?" Marcus felt a moment of pride at being able to discuss technical details. He had always been interested in military aviation, even though he had never flown combat aircraft. "Well, the F-16 has this incredible power-to-weight ratio. It can pull 9 Gs in a sustained turn, which is more than most pilots can handle physically. The fly-by-wire control system makes it incredibly responsive." "Impressive," Sarah said. "And the weapons systems?" "Top of the line," Marcus continued, warming to the technical discussion. The M61A1 Vulcan cannon was standard, plus it could carry a variety of missiles and bombs on external hardpoints. AIM-120 AMRAAM for air-to-air, AGM-65 Maverick for ground targets. The targeting system was so advanced you could put a missile through a window from miles away. Sarah seemed genuinely impressed by his knowledge. "You really know these aircraft inside and out." "You have to," Marcus replied. "Your life depends on understanding every system, every capability, every limitation. When you're in combat, there's no time to consult a manual." They talked for another hour about aviation, with Marcus continuing to embellish his supposed military experience. Sarah asked thoughtful questions about everything from combat tactics to pilot training, and Marcus found himself enjoying both her attention and the opportunity to play the role of a war hero. "What was your call sign?" Sarah asked suddenly. Marcus hadn't expected that question, but he recovered quickly. "Maverick," he said, borrowing from Top Gun. "I know it sounds cliched, but I had a reputation for taking calculated risks that other pilots wouldn't." "Maverick," Sarah repeated, a slight smile playing at her lips. "That's quite a reputation to live up to." "I did my best," Marcus replied modestly. "Though I'll admit some of those risks didn't always pay off. I had my share of close calls." He launched into another fabricated story about a dogfight over enemy territory. where he claimed to have outmaneuvered 2 enemy fighters despite being outnumbered. The story was pure fiction, but Marcus had watched enough military footage to make it sound convincing. "You're lucky to be alive," Sarah said when he finished. "We all were," Marcus replied solemnly. "Lost some good pilots over there. That's the reality of combat aviation that the movies don't show you. For every successful mission, there's always the possibility that you won't make it home." Sarah was quiet for a moment, and Marcus wondered if he had struck too serious a tone. But when she looked up, her expression was thoughtful rather than uncomfortable. "Do you keep in touch with your squadron mates?" she asked. "Some of them," Marcus lied smoothly. "Military friendships are different. When you've been through combat together, there's a bond that never goes away. Though it's hard sometimes talking to civilian friends about what we experienced. They don't really understand." "I can imagine," Sarah said softly. "It must be isolating sometimes." Marcus nodded, actually feeling a moment of genuine emotion despite the fictional nature of his story. "That's why nights like this are nice. Meeting someone who seems to really understand the complexities of aviation." "What do you do now?" Sarah asked. "Besides commercial flying, I mean." "Mostly just work," Marcus replied. "Fly domestic routes, nothing too exciting. Sometimes I do some consulting work for aviation companies, help them understand military specifications and requirements. My combat experience gives me insights that pure civilian pilots don't have." Sarah nodded. "That makes sense. Your military background must be valuable in the civilian world." "It is," Marcus agreed. "Though sometimes I miss the adrenaline, you know? Commercial aviation is safe and predictable, but it lacks the edge that combat flying had." They continued talking as the bar gradually emptied around them. Marcus found himself genuinely enjoying Sarah's company, beyond just the ego boost of impressing her with his stories. She was intelligent, asked good questions, and seemed to have a real understanding of aviation. "I should probably get going soon," Sarah said, glancing at her watch. "Early flight tomorrow." "Of course," Marcus said, not wanting the evening to end. "This has been really enjoyable. It's rare to meet someone who understands aviation the way you do." "Thank you," Sarah replied. "Your stories have been fascinating. Really gives me a new perspective on combat aviation." Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction. He had successfully impressed an intelligent, attractive woman with his fabricated military heroics. It had been one of the better evenings he had had in months. "Maybe we could continue this conversation sometime," Marcus suggested hopefully. "I'd love to hear more about your work in aviation." Sarah smiled mysteriously. "I think we might have more to talk about than you realize," she said. But before Marcus could ask what she meant, she was gathering her things to leave. The next morning, Marcus woke up feeling pleased with himself. The evening with Sarah had gone better than he could have hoped. He had impressed her with his stories, and she seemed genuinely interested in both his supposed military experience and him personally. He found himself looking forward to potentially seeing her again. Marcus checked his phone while getting dressed for the final day of the conference. There was a message from the conference organizers about a special presentation that had been added to the schedule. Something about real combat aviation experiences. Marcus deleted it without reading the full details, more interested in his coffee and the possibility of running into Sarah again. The conference hall was busier than usual for the final morning. Marcus grabbed his coffee and continental breakfast, scanning the crowd for Sarah's auburn hair and navy blazer. He spotted several people he had met over the past few days and made small talk, but part of his attention was always searching for her. "Ladies and gentlemen," the conference moderator announced from the main stage, "we have a special addition to today's program. We're honored to have a distinguished military aviator who will be sharing real experiences from combat operations. Please welcome Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell." Marcus nearly choked on his coffee. Sarah walked onto the stage, but she looked completely different from the woman he had spent the evening with. She was wearing a crisp Air Force dress uniform decorated with numerous ribbons and medals. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a regulation style, and her entire demeanor radiated military professionalism. "Thank you for having me," Sarah said into the microphone, her voice carrying the same confidence Marcus remembered, but now with an unmistakable tone of authority. "I'm here to talk about the realities of combat aviation, based on my 15 years of active duty service." Marcus felt his stomach drop as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. This wasn't just someone interested in aviation. This was a real military pilot, a real combat veteran, and he had spent the entire evening lying to her about experiences she actually had. "I flew F-16 Fighting Falcons for over a decade," Sarah continued, and Marcus felt his face burning with embarrassment. "Including multiple combat deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. The aircraft we call the Viper in operational circles." The irony hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had used the call sign Maverick and bragged about flying the very aircraft this woman had actually flown in real combat. Every detail he had fabricated, she had lived through for real. Sarah began her presentation with technical details about F-16 capabilities, and Marcus recognized much of the information he had regurgitated to her the night before. Except when she said it, it came with the weight of genuine experience. She talked about actual weapon systems she had used, real missions she had flown, and the true emotional cost of combat operations. "Combat aviation isn't glamorous," Sarah said, her eyes scanning the audience. "It's not like the movies. It's about precision, training, and making life-or-death decisions while under extreme stress. Every mission carries real consequences for real people." Marcus slumped deeper into his seat, hoping she wouldn't spot him in the crowd. But even as he tried to hide, he found himself genuinely fascinated by her presentation. This was what real combat flying actually looked like, not the fabricated adventure stories he had been telling. "One of the most challenging aspects of combat aviation is the responsibility you carry," Sarah continued. "When you're providing close air support for ground troops, their lives literally depend on your accuracy and judgment. There's no room for error." She described a mission remarkably similar to one of the stories Marcus had told her, except her version carried the weight of genuine emotion and real consequence. She talked about the stress, the fear, and the professional satisfaction of successfully completing missions that saved lives. "People often ask about the emotional toll," Sarah said. "How do you handle taking lives? How do you deal with seeing friends and colleagues killed in action? These aren't questions you can answer with bravado or tough guy stories. They require honest reflection about what it means to serve in combat." Marcus realized that every story he had told the night before was a shallow parody of real experiences this woman had actually lived through. He had turned genuine sacrifice and service into entertainment, and he had done it to impress the very person who had actually made those sacrifices. "The camaraderie among combat pilots is real," Sarah continued, "but it's forged through shared danger and mutual dependence, not through boasting or war stories. We look out for each other because we understand the stakes in ways that can't be communicated to those who haven't been there." During a break in the presentation, Marcus considered leaving the conference early. The embarrassment was overwhelming, and he couldn't imagine facing Sarah after what had happened. But something kept him in his seat, perhaps a masochistic need to hear what real combat aviation was actually like. When Sarah resumed her presentation, she talked about transitioning from military to civilian aviation. "Many combat veterans struggle with the adjustment," she said. "Commercial flying can feel mundane after the intensity of combat operations, but there's also relief in flying missions where the goal is simply to transport people safely to their destinations." Marcus thought about his own comfortable job flying commercial routes. He had never experienced the stress and responsibility Sarah was describing, yet he had pretended to miss it the night before. "I want to address something that concerns me about civilian aviation culture," Sarah said, her tone becoming more serious. "There's sometimes a tendency to romanticize military service and combat operations. People tell war stories that aren't theirs, or embellish their actual service to sound more impressive." Marcus felt like she was speaking directly to him, even though she was addressing the entire audience. "This does a disservice to those who actually served in combat," Sarah continued. "Real military experience comes with real costs. When people appropriate those experiences for their own benefit, it diminishes the sacrifices made by actual service members." The audience was completely silent, and Marcus wondered if others were also feeling the weight of her words. "I've encountered this personally," Sarah said, and Marcus's blood ran cold. "Just last night, in fact. I met someone who claimed extensive combat experience in the same aircraft I actually flew in combat. It was educational to hear his version of experiences I actually lived through." Marcus wanted to disappear. He knew with absolute certainty that she was talking about him, and he suspected that at least some people in the audience might put the pieces together. "The real tragedy," Sarah concluded, is that honest civilian aviation experience has its own value and dignity. There's no need to embellish or fabricate military service to be impressive or interesting. Commercial aviation serves a vital function, and those who do it well deserve respect for their actual accomplishments. As Sarah finished her presentation to enthusiastic applause, Marcus sat frozen in his seat, finally understanding the full scope of his humiliation. After Sarah's presentation ended, Marcus sat paralyzed in his chair as conference attendees filed out around him. The applause had been thunderous, and he had watched several people approach the stage to speak with Sarah personally. Meanwhile, he remained frozen, wrestling with the magnitude of his humiliation. He finally forced himself to stand when the conference hall was nearly empty, but instead of leaving, he found himself walking toward the stage. He wasn't sure what he planned to say, but he knew he couldn't just disappear without acknowledging what had happened. Sarah was packing up her presentation materials when she noticed him approaching. Her expression was unreadable as she watched him walk up the steps to the stage platform. "Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell," Marcus said awkwardly, not sure how to begin. "You can call me Sarah," she replied calmly. "We're past formalities at this point, don't you think?" Marcus took a deep breath. "I owe you an apology." "A huge apology." Sarah finished packing her laptop and turned to face him fully. "I'm listening." "Everything I told you last night was a lie," Marcus said, the words coming out in a rush. "I never flew combat missions. I was in the Air Force for 4 years, but I flew transport planes on domestic routes. I never saw combat, never deployed overseas, never did any of the things I claimed." Sarah nodded slowly. "I know. You knew?" Marcus asked, surprised. "I suspected early on, but I became certain when you said your call sign was Maverick," Sarah explained. "No real military pilot would use a call sign from a movie. Plus, some of your technical details were off, and your stories had a Hollywood quality that real combat experiences don't have." Marcus felt even worse knowing that she had been aware of his lies throughout their conversation. "Then why did you keep listening? Why did you encourage me to keep talking?" Sarah leaned against the podium, considering her answer. "Partly curiosity. I wanted to see how far you would take it. But mostly I was trying to understand why someone would feel the need to fabricate military service." "I don't know why," Marcus admitted. "I guess I wanted to seem more interesting, more impressive. Commercial flying feels ordinary compared to what you've actually done." "That's where you're wrong," Sarah said firmly. "Commercial aviation is incredibly important work. You transport hundreds of people safely every day. You've probably never lost a passenger, never had a serious accident. That's not ordinary, that's exceptional." Marcus hadn't expected this response. "But it's not exciting like combat flying." "Marcus, do you know what I missed most during my combat deployments?" Sarah asked. "Routine flights where nobody was shooting at me. Flights where the biggest concern was weather delays, not enemy fire. There's tremendous value in boring, safe aviation." They were silent for a moment as Marcus processed this perspective. "I need to ask you something," Sarah continued. "Have you told these stories before?" "To other people?" Marcus hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, not the specific details, but I've implied that my military service was more extensive than it actually was." "That has to stop," Sarah said, her tone becoming more serious. "It's not just embarrassing for you. It's disrespectful to actual veterans, and it spreads misconceptions about what military service really involves." "I know that now," Marcus said. "After listening to your presentation, I understand how wrong I was. Your real experiences made my fake stories seem like cheap entertainment." Sarah studied his face carefully. "I believe you're genuinely remorseful. But the question is, what are you going to do about it?" "What do you mean?" "Well, you can't take back the lies you've told, but you can commit to being honest going forward," Sarah explained. "And more than that, you can use this experience to develop a real understanding of military service instead of the fantasy version you've been promoting." Marcus nodded eagerly. "How can I do that?" "Start by learning about actual military aviation," Sarah suggested. "Read memoirs by real combat pilots. Understand the history and reality of military service. If you're genuinely interested in this subject, approach it with the respect it deserves." "I will," Marcus promised. "But I have to ask, why are you being so understanding about this? You could have humiliated me publicly. You could have called me out during your presentation." Sarah smiled slightly. "I could have. And honestly, part of me wanted to, but I've learned that humiliation rarely changes behavior for the better. You're clearly embarrassed enough as it is. More than embarrassed, Marcus admitted. I feel sick about the whole thing. Good, Sarah said. That means you understand the gravity of what you did. Now the question is whether you'll learn from it or just feel bad about it. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Can I ask you something personal? You can ask. What was combat actually like? Not the technical details, but emotionally. Sarah considered the question carefully. Terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. But mostly it was about duty and responsibility. Every mission mattered because real lives were at stake. That weight never leaves you, even years later. Do you regret it? No, Sarah said without hesitation. But I don't romanticize it either. It was a job that needed to be done, and I was trained to do it. The real heroism isn't in the flying. It's in the commitment to serve something larger than yourself. Marcus felt a deep sense of shame as he realized how his lies had trivialized this commitment. I'm truly sorry, Sarah. Not just for lying to you, but for cheapening what you and others like you have actually done. Apology accepted, Sarah said. But here's what I want from you going forward. When people ask about your military service, tell them the truth. Transport flying is honorable work too, and if you encounter other people telling fake war stories, consider speaking up. I will, Marcus promised. Sarah gathered her things and prepared to leave. You know, Marcus, you seem like a decent person who made a bad choice. Don't let this mistake define you, but don't forget the lesson either. As she walked away, Marcus remained on the stage, finally understanding the difference between real service and the fantasy version he had been selling. For the first time in years, he felt motivated to be genuinely proud of his actual accomplishments rather than seeking validation through fabricated heroics. The conference hall was now completely empty except for cleaning staff preparing for the next event. Marcus stood alone, processing everything that had happened and beginning to plan how he would change his behavior going forward. 3 months after the conference, Marcus sat in his apartment reading Viper Pilot by Dan Hampton, one of several memoirs by actual F-16 combat pilots that Sarah had recommended. The book painted a vivid and honest picture of what combat aviation really involved, and Marcus found himself both fascinated and humbled by the authentic accounts. His reading was interrupted by his phone buzzing with a text from his colleague Jake, who was hosting a barbecue that afternoon. Marcus had been dreading social gatherings lately because they often led to conversations about military service, and he was still learning how to navigate those discussions honestly. At the barbecue, Marcus found himself in a familiar situation. Jake was introducing him to some neighbors, and the conversation naturally turned to careers and backgrounds. Marcus here is a pilot, Jake announced proudly. Used to be in the military too. Tell them about some of your experiences, Marcus. In the past, this would have been Marcus's cue to launch into fabricated stories about combat missions and heroic adventures. Instead, he felt his stomach tighten as he searched for the right words. I was in the Air Force for 4 years, Marcus said carefully. I flew transport planes, mostly moving supplies and personnel between domestic bases. It was good experience that helped me transition to commercial aviation. One of the neighbors, a man named Robert, leaned forward with interest. That's cool, but did you ever see any action? Any overseas deployments? No, Marcus replied honestly. My service was entirely domestic. Transport flying isn't as exciting as combat aviation, but it taught me a lot about aircraft systems and aviation safety. Marcus could see the slight disappointment in Robert's expression, and he felt the familiar urge to embellish his story, but he forced himself to stay honest, remembering Sarah's words about the value of truthful service. Still pretty impressive, Jake said supportively. Not everyone has the skills to fly military aircraft. The conversation moved on to other topics, and Marcus felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. The relief came from not having to maintain elaborate lies, but he couldn't deny missing the attention and admiration that his fake war stories used to generate. Later that evening, Marcus was surprised to receive an email from Sarah. They had stayed in touch sporadically since the conference, mainly sharing articles about aviation safety and military history. Hi, Marcus, her email read. I hope you don't mind me reaching out, but I wanted to share something with you. I'm organizing a panel discussion for next month's Veterans Aviation Forum about transitioning from military to civilian aviation careers. We're looking for perspectives from both combat and non-combat veterans. Would you be interested in participating? Marcus read the email twice, unsure how to respond. The idea of speaking publicly about his military experience terrified him, especially in front of actual veterans. He called Sarah the next day. "I got your email about the panel discussion," he said. "I'm honored that you thought of me, but I'm not sure I belong on a panel with real veterans." "What do you mean by real veterans?" Sarah asked pointedly. "You know what I mean. People who actually deployed, who actually served in important roles." "Marcus, you served in the Air Force for 4 years," Sarah said firmly. "You contributed to military operations even if you weren't in combat. Transport aviation is essential to military readiness. Without people doing your job, combat operations couldn't happen." Marcus hadn't thought about it that way before. "But my experience seems so ordinary compared to what you've been through." "That's exactly why we need your perspective," Sarah explained. "Most military aviation careers are like yours, not like mine. We need to show young people considering military service that there are many ways to serve meaningfully, not just the Hollywood version of combat aviation." After much internal debate, Marcus agreed to participate in the panel. The weeks leading up to the event were filled with anxiety as he prepared to speak honestly about his actual military experience for the first time in years. The Veterans Aviation Forum was smaller and more intimate than the conference where he had first met Sarah. The audience consisted mainly of veterans, current military personnel, and young people considering military careers. Marcus sat on the panel alongside Sarah, a helicopter pilot who had served in Iraq, and a maintenance officer who had spent 20 years keeping aircraft operational. He felt intimidated by their extensive service records, but Sarah had coached him to focus on his own genuine experiences, rather than comparing himself to others. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he took a deep breath and began. "My name is Marcus Thompson, and I served as a transport pilot in the Air Force for 4 years. I never deployed overseas, never flew combat missions, and honestly, for a long time I felt like my service wasn't important enough to talk about." He could see some audience members nodding in recognition, and he realized that many of them probably had similar feelings about their own non-combat service. "But I've learned that every role in military aviation matters," Marcus continued. "The flights I made moving personnel and supplies might not have been glamorous, but they were necessary. Military operations depend on logistics, on getting the right people and equipment to the right places at the right times." Marcus talked about the technical skills he had learned, the teamwork required for successful missions, and the pride he felt in contributing to military readiness. For the first time, he focused on what he had actually accomplished rather than what he wished he had done. During the question and answer period, a young woman in the audience asked, "Do you feel like your non-combat service prepared you well for civilian aviation?" "Absolutely," Marcus replied. "Military aviation taught me precision, attention to detail, and the importance of following procedures exactly. Those skills translate directly to commercial aviation, where safety is the top priority." After the panel, several audience members approached Marcus to thank him for his honest perspective. A young man considering military service said that Marcus's presentation had helped him understand that there were meaningful ways to serve, even if he wasn't interested in combat roles. Sarah walked up to Marcus as the event was ending. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Good," Marcus replied, somewhat surprised by his own answer. "Really good, actually. Better than I've felt after talking about my military experience in years." "That's what honesty feels like," Sarah said with a smile. "You should be proud of what you actually accomplished, not ashamed that it wasn't something else." As Marcus drove home that evening, he reflected on how much had changed since that embarrassing night at the conference. He was finally learning to value his real experiences and accomplishments, and he was discovering that authenticity felt much better than the temporary validation that had come from his lies. For the first time in years, Marcus felt genuinely proud of his military service, not because he had fabricated heroic stories about it, but because he had finally learned to appreciate what he had actually contributed. 1 year after the conference that had changed his perspective, Marcus found himself back at another aviation industry event. This time, however, he approached conversations with a completely different mindset. He had spent the past year learning to appreciate his actual accomplishments and had become an advocate for honest military service narratives. Marcus was presenting his own workshop this time, titled "The Value of Support Aviation: Lessons from Transport Operations." The room was filled with both military and civilian aviation professionals, and he felt confident in a way that was entirely different from the false bravado he used to rely on. Military aviation isn't just about fighter jets and combat missions. Marcus began his presentation. For every combat pilot, there are dozens of support personnel making those missions possible. Transport pilots, maintenance crews, air traffic controllers, logistics coordinators. We all play vital roles in military readiness. He spoke about the technical challenges of transport aviation, the importance of precision in cargo loading and weight distribution, and the critical nature of delivering personnel and supplies on time. His presentation was based entirely on his real experiences, and the authenticity resonated with the audience. During the break, a young Air Force lieutenant approached him. "Thank you for that presentation," she said. "I'm currently flying transport missions, and sometimes I feel like my job isn't as important as what the fighter pilots do." "I used to feel exactly the same way," Marcus replied honestly. "It took me years to realize that importance isn't measured by how dangerous or exciting your job is, but by how well you execute your mission and contribute to the larger objective." They talked for several more minutes about the challenges and rewards of transport aviation. Marcus found genuine satisfaction in encouraging this young officer to take pride in her actual service rather than wishing for something different. Later that afternoon, Marcus was surprised to see Sarah enter the conference hall. She was in civilian clothes this time, having recently transitioned from active duty to working for a defense contractor. "I heard about your workshop," Sarah said, approaching him during another break. "I'm impressed. This is quite a change from the Marcus I met a year ago." "I've learned a lot since then," Marcus replied, "mostly thanks to the wake-up call you gave me." "You did the hard work," Sarah said. "I just pointed out what you probably already knew deep down." They found seats in a quiet corner of the conference hall and caught up on the past year. Sarah told him about her transition to civilian work and her ongoing efforts to mentor young military aviators. Marcus shared his experiences speaking at veteran events and his growing involvement with organizations that supported transitioning military personnel. "I have to tell you something," Marcus said. "A few months ago I encountered someone at a different conference who was telling fake war stories. Stories very similar to the ones I used to tell." "What did you do?" Sarah asked. "I talked to him privately the way you talked to me," Marcus explained. "I told him about my own experience with fabricating military service and how it had backfired. I think I got through to him," Sarah smiled. "That's exactly what needs to happen. Veterans helping other veterans understand the value of honest service." As the conference continued, Marcus noticed something that never would have occurred to him a year earlier. There were many attendees like him, people with genuine military experience who seemed uncomfortable talking about it because their service didn't match the Hollywood version of military heroics. During the networking dinner that evening, Marcus made an effort to connect with these individuals. He talked with a former Navy mechanic who had kept aircraft operational on carrier deployments, an Air Force air traffic controller who had managed busy military airfields, and a Coast Guard pilot who had conducted search and rescue operations. "You know what I've noticed?" Marcus said to the group that had gathered around their table. "We all have valuable military experience, but we tend to downplay it because it doesn't match what people expect military service to look like." The Navy mechanic nodded. "People always want to hear about combat, but my job was making sure aircraft were safe to fly. That seems boring compared to war stories." "But without you, there wouldn't be any war stories," Marcus replied. "Combat operations depend entirely on maintenance and logistics. Your work probably saved more lives than any individual combat mission." The conversation continued throughout the evening, with each person sharing their real experiences and gradually understanding the importance of their actual contributions. Marcus realized that his year-long journey from fabricated heroics to authentic pride had led him to this moment, helping others recognize the value of their genuine service. A week after the conference, Marcus received an email that surprised him. It was from the young Air Force lieutenant he had spoken with during his workshop. "Mr. Thompson," the email read, "I wanted to thank you again for our conversation. I've been thinking about what you said about measuring importance by mission execution rather than excitement level. I've started a small group at my base for transport and support personnel to share experiences and learn from each other. Would you be willing to speak to our group via video conference sometime?" Marcus immediately replied that he would be honored to participate. Over the following months, he found himself regularly speaking to military groups about the importance of honest service narratives and the value of support roles in military operations. 6 months later, Marcus was invited to be a keynote speaker at a major veterans conference. As he prepared his presentation, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. He had transformed from someone who fabricated military heroics to impress strangers into someone who genuinely helped other veterans appreciate their real contributions. The night before his keynote speech, Marcus called Sarah to thank her one final time for the intervention that had changed his life. "You know what the best part is?" Marcus told her. "I actually feel proud of my military service now. Not because I've convinced myself it was something it wasn't, but because I finally understand what it actually was." "That's what I hoped would happen," Sarah replied. "Real pride is much more satisfying than fake admiration." As Marcus delivered his keynote speech the next day, he looked out at an audience filled with veterans from all branches of service and all types of military occupations. He spoke about the dangers of stolen valor, the importance of honest service narratives, and the vital contributions made by every person who serves, regardless of their specific role. Military service comes in many forms, Marcus concluded his speech. Some serve in combat, others in support roles. Some deploy overseas, others serve domestically. But every person who puts on the uniform and commits to serving something larger than themselves deserves respect for their actual contribution, not judgment for what their service wasn't. The standing ovation that followed was the most satisfying recognition Marcus had ever received, because for the first time in his life he had earned it honestly.